For step 2, I'm going to paint light and mid-tone washes on the trees and the rapeseed field. So I'm mixing up here Hansa Yellow Light and Hansa Yellow Light with a pinch of Cerulean to make a really lovely limey green. As you can see here, I'm using a size 8 brush. They're quite milky washes, not too dilute. This is Hansa Yellow Deep mixed with a pinch of Pyrrol Red. Any red will do. And this is for these lovely warm colours on the trees. A little bit more Hansa Yellow Light here with a bit of the Hansa Yellow Deep. So I just want to really capture the colours that I can see in the photograph. So mixing up some burnt sienna here as well, just for those sort of mid-tonal values with a pinch of the Hansa Yellow Deep. Again, a milky consistency. I put a pinch of red in there as well, just to warm that colour up. And I'm just mixing up some quinacridone gold here. Always mix up your colours first. I'm using a natural sponge and I'm sponging in the lightest colour first, so work light to dark or light to mid-tone. If you don't have a natural sponge, don't worry, you could use a scourer or the side of your brush for side brush, dry brush. And I'll put a link in the description below where I describe these sort of techniques in much more detail. So I've just gone in with the limey green here as well, and I'm tapping on to the dry surface very gently. Don't press too hard. And if you're using a sponge, try to vary the mark. So change the angle of your sponge so you don't end up with a symmetrical pattern. So make it look more natural. So going in with the slightly warmer colours now, the Hansa Yellow Deep. And again, you can vary these colours. Towards the bottom of the tree, it's a lot lighter and there's a lot warmer colours at the top of the trees with a little bit of that lime green in the middle. So again, as you can see, I'm changing the angle of my wrist so I get different marks. And I'm going in with the burnt sienna, pinch of the Hansa Yellow Deep and red for the top part of the tree. So you could say now I'm actually working wet into wet here. So the colours are actually mixing on the paper, but I'm doing this very gently and just taking my time, literally tickling the sponge onto the surface there. I'm mixing up some more burnt sienna here with a little bit of the quinacridone gold, and I've actually applied it to the sponge directly, and I'm sponging pretty much now damp into damp. The consistency is milky and the paper isn't too wet, and I'm gently sponging this mid-tone colour at the top of both the trees. I've loaded my size 8 mop brush and I'm painting the top part of the rapeseed field here, wet on dry, with that sort of light yellow colour. I'm also painting over the distant trees as well. I'm using a bit of Hansa Yellow Deep for the distant trees on the right here. I've just diluted it a little bit, it was a bit too strong, and just tickling that paint there, wet on dry, and lifting off a little bit of that Hansa Yellow Deep so it doesn't go into the rapeseed field directly below. I've just diluted that Hansa Yellow Light there just to make sure it's really light directly below the trees. You can see in the photograph how much light there is, and it really does bring the whole painting to life. So I'm just working my way down. I've swapped to a larger brush, large area, large brush, and I'm just diluting that yellow down to the bottom of the painting there. And then just adding a little bit more Hansa Yellow Light over the top there. So you pretty much got a wash of Hansa Yellow Light, tickling those distant trees there using the tip of my brush to create texture at the top of the trees there. And I'm just using a little bit of the quinacridone gold and burnt sienna here and there in the field, very dilute, just to create a little bit of warmth. I'm steering clear of the very light yellow right on the horizon, directly beneath those trees. I want to keep that lovely and light. I've mixed up the Hansa Yellow Light and Cerulean. I'm spattering it wet into wet into the kind of middle ground and foreground there, and I'm keeping the top part of the rapeseed field lighter, and I'm using the paper towel to protect the top part of the field, the sky and the trees as well there. And this is just to create lovely soft textures in the middle ground and foreground. Also using Hansa yellow light on its own here as well, just to really build up the textures here. And I'm sprinkling on some table salt onto the top part of the field there and a little bit in the centre as well to create light textures once dry. And I'm stippling in some more marks here in the foreground using my size 8 brush with a creamy mixture of Hansa Yellow Deep. And I'm just spritzing the edge of the trees there just to soften them in places to make them look more natural. I'm using the Hansa Yellow Light with the Cerulean to create a limey green, painting it directly onto the sponge, and I'm going to sponge the foreground damp into damp to create a stronger green, which you can see in the photograph, and a little bit more detail. I'm painting the bottom of the tree trunks wet on dry with a mixture of the burnt sienna and Hansa Yellow Deep with my size 8 brush. I'm going to allow the painting to dry naturally to allow the salt to work. And as you can see, there's some lovely textures there in the field, especially at the top. For step 3, I'm going to mask the trees and the field using masking fluid. I'm going to coat the sponge with hand liquid soap to protect the sponge while I use the masking fluid. I'm pouring out the masking fluid here to make it easier to sponge. So I've dipped it into the masking fluid and I've just sort of tapped the sponge gently to the side there just to get rid of the excess masking fluid. So I can tap gently over the trees here, previously sponged with the watercolour. I don't want to disturb the paint because watercolour isn't permanent, but I want to create that lovely texture of the foliage. And this way I can create the texture with the masking fluid and protect the paint underneath when I come to paint the sky. And I'm tapping very gently again with the masking fluid. I'm going to do the same on the field, protecting all of those light washes, making sure I don't lose my light. So again, tapping here in the foreground, changing the angle of my wrist as well to create different marks. I'm going to allow the masking fluid to dry naturally. So for step 4, I'm going to paint the sky wet into wet. So I'm mixing up Pyrrol Red and I'm going to mix up some Phthalo blue with it, about 50-50, and it's going to be a milky consistency. So I'm mixing up some more Phthalo blue, this time with some Paynes grey and a little bit of the quinacridone rose, and it's just to make a kind of a grey blue violet. I'm wetting the paper with a large mop brush with plenty of clean water. Now remember, I've masked out the trees, so I can carefully paint over the trees. Now, not everything is masked out, so I didn't mask out every little bit of the foliage. So some of the foliage may bleed. Don't worry about that because the yellow, the orange or the green will mix nicely with the violet and the greys, etc. So wetting down to the horizon, loading my brush with the Phthalo blue and Pyrrol Red. I'm just painting that sort of shadow in the centre of the sky, tilting, painting that sort of blue, violet, grey at the top, again tilting both ways. Let everything sort of run down. And I've left big gaps there for the clouds. I'm actually sort of squeezing my brush there and dripping in a diluted Paynes grey, Phthalo blue with a pinch of pink, and I'm tilting, allowing the paint, this sort of bead of paint, to run down to the right hand side, and then I'm collecting the puddles at the end with a clean damp brush. Loading my brush with the Phthalo blue and red, squeezing the brush hairs and allowing the paint to fall onto the paper and to drizzle onto the tree. Again, don't worry, this has been masked out, but even if it gets into a gap, it will look like the sky behind the tree. I'm spritzing here with my spritzer bottle just to get the paint moving. It also dilutes the paint a little as well. I'm tilting at a 90-degree angle to get the paint moving to look more natural and atmospheric. Mixing up some more Phthalo blue and Pyrrol Red, slightly thicker, so it'll be darker. And I'm painting this damp into damp at the top of the sky using my size 8 mop brush, tilting forwards to allow the paint to run down and sideways. So it's a lovely dark sort of cloud above. This will create depth in your painting because this is the sky above your head. So it's a bigger cloud and it's darker in tonal value, and that comes forward to create depth. For step 5, I'm going to paint more details on the field. So using a large brush, I am mixing up some of the Hansa yellow light and painting it wet on dry on top of the masking fluid. So remember, I've already masked out a light yellow wash. So this is kind of like a medium tonal value. Mixing up some sap green now. Using the sponge, I'm sponging damp into damp at the sort of foreground area of the field with the sap green to paint the sort of green foliage just here and there. Remember to sponge very gently. I'm going to allow the painting to dry once more. For step 6, I'm going to paint the distant trees. I'm using my size 6 round brush and I'm painting sap green with a mixture of the sky colour, and that was the phthalo blue with the Pyrrol Red. And this will neutralise the green, so the green doesn't look too bright and it will recede. So I'm just adding a slightly sort of darker colour there using the Pyrrol Red and the phthalo blue mix and sort of mixing that wet into wet. I'm also using the tip of my brush to create texture both at the top of the trees and at the bottom of the trees, cutting in to the rapeseed field and dropping in a darker green wet into wet at the bottom of the trees. So I'm going to continue on working on the distant trees, starting off wet on dry and using the tip of the brush to cut in to the bottom of the trees and to create texture at the top of the trees, varying the heights, and then drop in a darker colour at the bottom of the trees, wet into wet. I'm using the bottom of my tube of paint to pull out some of the wet paint to create the look of the top of the trees. There are some larger trees here to the right, so I've added a little bit of quinacridone gold at the top here, painting wet on dry with my size 4 round brush and just blending it in to the sap green on the right, a little bit more of that quinacridone gold and blending it there to the left, dropping in some burnt sienna now towards the bottom of these trees and cutting in to the top of the field. Mixing up some more sap green now with a little bit of water, and I'm going to press a little piece of sponge very gently on to the foreground area here just to create slightly stronger green. This again is to create depth in the painting. Having this stronger, darker marks here in the foreground pulls the foreground forward. Again, vary those marks. You can also stipple with your brush, creating different sort of marks. And I'm sort of half closing my eyes as I look at the photograph to paint in these sort of semi-abstract marks just here and there. Just adding a little bit more details to these trees here just to make the top of the trees look more natural. And I've used burnt sienna mixed with ultramarine. And I'm just spattering now the middle ground of the field here using the Hansa yellow light and some of the sap green as well. I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. For step 7, I am going to remove the masking fluid and paint the tree trunks and branches. And then I'm going to sponge over the top of some of those branches just to make them look more natural. I'm removing the masking fluid with some framing tape. You can use washi tape, a putty rubber, paper towel, or even your thumb. Just make sure the painting is thoroughly dry. I've mixed up burnt sienna with Paynes grey, and of course there's a little bit of sap green underneath. And I'm going to start painting the tree trunks here on the right hand side, the dark shadow, using my size 4 round brush, and I'm leaving the left hand side lighter. And I'm now using a clean damp brush just to blend and soften, and use my paper towel just to lift off any paint on the left hand side so it looks like the light is hitting it from the left, and just adding a little bit more dark there on the right hand side. So again, painting this left tree trunk here, wet on dry with my size 4 round brush, leaving the light on the left hand side, and then using a clean damp brush just to soften that hard edge. And I'm just adding a little bit more dark to the right hand side just to really accentuate the shadow on the right. So I am using my size 4 round brush just to paint these lower branches, wet on dry. I'm pretty much using the tip of my brush. Take your time. There's no rush when you're painting branches. You can stop and have a break and come back to it. If you find painting branches tricky, you can turn your painting upside down. Sometimes it's easier to paint smaller branches, especially upside down, because you just pull the paint and the brush towards you. So you might want to have a go at that, or even paint sideways as well. I'm using a liner brush. That's a long haired brush, and it's about a size 2, so it's quite a thin brush, but you can really capture the look of these long thin branches. And I'm sort of leaving gaps as well to allow the foliage to come through, so you can stop and start your branches. I will also be sponging on top of these branches later, so push the branches back in some areas to make them look like they're growing inside the foliage to create depth in the painting. So I'm sponging on top of the dried branches now, using the colours that I used previously. So this is the Hansa yellow light, and I'm gently sponging it pretty much over the top of some of the branches there, just to push them back so they look like they're behind the foliage or growing through the foliage. Using some of the sap green now, tapping that in gently, just building up that detail. So I've actually mixed up some burnt sienna with green, and I'm just tapping that here and there to create some shadow under the foliage just here and there. And I'm just using the burnt sienna and Paynes grey again, using my liner brush, just adding a few more darks here and there to the tree trunk and branches, just to really sort of sharpen them up, make the trees look more 3D. For step 8, the final stage, I'm going to remove the masking fluid from the field, and I'm going to finish off with some darks and details. So again, I'm removing the masking fluid here with the framing tape. And I must say, I really love all the light and textures in this field. So I think I'm going to leave the field, but I've decided just to add a few more darks and details to the horizon line. I'm using my size 4 round brush, painting wet on dry, with a mixture of the Paynes grey and sap green, just adding a few more darks here and there. I'm removing the washi tape to reveal a lovely white border, and it also gives me time to assess to see if I need to do any more to my painting. And I've decided just to lift off some of the dark on the tree here. I felt I didn't have enough light, so I'm lifting off using a clean damp brush and a paper towel just to take off the residue paint there, so it creates that lovely light on the left hand side. I wasn't happy about this large group of trees here. The tops of the trees didn't look very natural, so I'm lifting off with a clean damp brush and a paper towel. And I'm just sponging in a little bit of texture here using the burnt sienna and Hansa yellow light, a little bit of sap green, just to add some textures. And I'm lifting off some of the paint using a plastic card to create lighter tree trunks and branches. Now, you may not need to do this, so don't worry about this area. It's just it looked a little bit flat. So it just shows that you can make changes in watercolour. And here's a close-up. I really love that field there. Looks so effective using that masking fluid technique and building up, working light to dark, creating the texture with the sponge, spattering the salt technique, etc. So I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and it inspires you to paint something similar. And if you'd like to learn more about watercolour, get access to exclusive videos and downloadable outline sketches, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about that can be found in the description below, and you can cancel anytime. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.